There is a moment, deep in an Afghan highland winter, when the cold stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like a decision the mountain made about you. The temperature drops past -20. The wind doesn't howl. It reasons with you, slowly and without mercy, pressing against every gap in your clothing, every crack in your door, every miscalculation you made back in autumn. And somewhere in that darkness, a man is already awake. He was awake before the sun had any intention of rising. He is pulling on layers that were never fully dry from the day before, and he is walking toward his animals before he has eaten a single thing. Because in winter, herd life in Afghanistan, the animals come first. They always have. Not out of sentiment. Out of mathematics. This is not a story about poverty. It is not a story about hardship in the way that word is usually used, as a synonym for backwardness or misfortune. What happens across the high-altitude pasture zones of Afghanistan every winter, in the Hindu Kush, in the ranges above Bamyan, in the valleys threading through Badakhshan and Ghor, is something closer to a masterwork of accumulated intelligence. It is a seasonal operating system built over centuries, running without electricity, without veterinary clinics within reach, without government support, and without the luxury of a single mistake. If you think the people managing winter herds in these mountains are simply surviving, you are misreading what you are looking at. They are executing a plan, and the plan is extraordinary. If you find yourself drawn to stories of human ingenuity in extreme places, the kind of knowledge that never made it into any textbook, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There is a great deal more of this waiting for you. The first thing you need to understand about winter herd life in the Afghan highlands is that it doesn't begin in winter. It begins in late summer, sometimes earlier, when the grasses on the high pastures are still thick and green, and the animals are still fat from months of open grazing. That is precisely when the calculation starts. A herder managing a mixed flock, sheep and goats, sometimes cattle, sometimes a small number of yaks in the highest zones, must look at his animals and perform a mental audit that would humble most livestock managers in the modern world. He is estimating how many animals he can carry through a winter of unknown severity. He is weighing the hay he has stored, the straw he has access to, the pasture that might remain accessible on south-facing slopes after snowfall. He is thinking about which animals are pregnant, which are old, which are the strongest producers, and which represent a net drain on resources he may not be able to replenish. And then he makes cuts. This is the part that people from outside the system rarely understand. The reduction of the herd before winter is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of mastery. A herder who enters winter with too many animals, hoping for the best, risks losing everything, not some animals, but all of them, in a catastrophic cascade of starvation and cold. A herder who reduces the herd to a number that matches his hay reserves exactly or slightly conservatively is not being pessimistic. He is being precise. The animals he keeps are the ones the system can sustain. Everything else is sold or slaughtered in autumn, which also serves the community, providing meat for households ahead of the lean months. Nothing about this is accidental. It is supply chain management operating in a context where the consequences of error are not financial. They are existential. Hay is the center of everything. In these communities, hay is not simply animal feed. It is stored energy, stored time, stored labor. The cutting of summer grass and its conversion into storable hay is one of the most labor-intensive periods of the Highland year, involving the entire family across multiple weeks. Men cut with hand scythes on slopes too steep and rocky for any vehicle. Women and children carry, spread, and turn the grass to dry it before the afternoon moisture descends from the peaks. The timing is surgical. Grass cut too early, before it has seeded, loses nutritional density. Grass left too long risks being rained on, which begins a mold process that can make it toxic. The optimal window in high-altitude Afghan terrain is often only a few days wide, and every family knows it by reading the plants, the wind, and the sky, not a calendar. Once dried, The hay is transported to the village and stored in ways that reveal another layer of engineering. Hay piles are not simply dumped in a corner. They are stacked against south-facing walls where reflected sunlight provides passive warmth that retards moisture absorption. They are elevated slightly off the ground on stone bases to prevent the earth's cold and damp from wicking upward into the stored mass, and they are loosely structured, not compressed, so that air can still move through the interior, preventing the anaerobic heat buildup that causes spontaneous fermentation. These are not decisions that were written down somewhere. They were tested across generations until only the correct methods survived, because the incorrect ones killed flocks and, by extension, families. The first snowfall changes everything. Not dramatically. In fact, the herds often continue grazing partially even after light snowfall, pawing through the surface to reach dried grasses underneath. Sheep are surprisingly effective at this. Goats even more so. But as snowpack deepens past a threshold, roughly knee-height on an adult sheep, outdoor grazing becomes both inefficient and dangerous, and the shift to full barn feeding begins. This transition is one of the most critical moments of the winter management cycle, and misreading it in either direction carries consequences. Too early, and you burn through hay reserves that will be desperately needed in February. Too late, and animals expend so much energy walking through deep snow, trying to find food, that they lose body mass faster than the hay can replace it. The herder's judgment on this single decision shapes the entire winter. The barns where the animals are housed in winter are themselves a form of cold climate architecture that deserves close attention. In much of the Afghan highlands, animal quarters are not separate structures. They share walls, sometimes floors and ceilings, with the human living space. This is not a matter of tradition for its own sake. The animals produce body heat continuously, and in a climate where firewood is scarce, that biological warmth is a resource too valuable to waste by isolating it in a separate building. A well-managed barn of 40 or 50 sheep can raise the temperature of an adjacent room by several degrees. In winters where temperatures outside reach levels that freeze water in minutes, those degrees are not a comfort. They are survival margin. The barn floor management is its own discipline. Fresh straw is added regularly on top of older layers rather than replacing them. This creates a deep litter system where the lower layers undergo slow microbial decomposition, which generates heat from within the floor itself. The animals stand on a surface that is biologically warm, insulated from the frozen ground below by the accumulated mass of partially composted material. By late winter, these layers can be half a meter deep. In spring, the entire mass is removed and becomes the primary fertilizer for the household's fields. Nothing is waste. Every input cycles into the next output. Water is a problem that winter creates in a way that surprises people who haven't thought carefully about it. Snow is everywhere, but snow is not water, not as far as a large animal is concerned. A sheep or goat cannot melt enough snow with its body heat to stay hydrated, and forcing animals to eat snow as their only water source accelerates heat loss and creates a hydration deficit that quietly undermines their condition over weeks. Water must be provided as liquid, which means it must be heated or collected from sources that don't freeze. In many highland communities, this means identifying specific spring sources that run year-round from geothermal or deep earth origins and building the daily animal management route around access to those sources. Twice a day, in the coldest period of winter, animals are brought to water. The path to that water, often a worn trail through snow that refreezes each night, is maintained by the herders themselves, broken open again each morning before the animals walk it, because an animal that slips on ice and injures a leg in winter has almost no chance of recovery. This is where the snow paths enter the picture, and they are more deliberate than they appear. The routes maintained between barns, water sources, stored hay, and any remaining accessible pasture are not random. They follow terrain logic, paths along ridgelines where wind scours the snow, keeping it shallower, paths across south-facing slopes where solar heating during the brief midday window softens the surface slightly, paths that avoid the north-facing depressions where snow consolidates into ice and drifts to depths that would exhaust any animal in minutes. The selection of these routes reflects a topographical knowledge of the landscape that is deeply particular to each valley. A herder from one village could not immediately manage the snowpaths of another valley 2 ridges away. The knowledge is local, embodied, and earned over a lifetime of reading the same terrain across every kind of winter. If what you are discovering here is changing how you think about these communities, if what looked like simple survival is starting to look like applied environmental science, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people find stories like this one, and it keeps this channel going. The feeding routine itself follows a logic that is less about generosity and more about conservation physiology. Animals in winter are not fed to satisfaction. They are fed to maintenance. The precise amount of energy input needed to keep body temperature stable, support pregnancy in the females carrying lambs or kids, and prevent muscle loss in the breeders that will be needed in spring. Overfeeding burns through reserves too quickly. Underfeeding causes the body to begin consuming muscle, which in pregnant females can trigger pregnancy complications that cascade rapidly. The balance point is not intuitive. It requires reading the animals daily, observing posture, coat condition, the brightness of the eye, the shape of the flank, and adjusting feeding amounts accordingly. The herder is reading a biological text that updates every 24 hours. Pregnant females receive the most careful management of the entire winter cycle. In Afghan highland herding, lambing and kidding are typically timed to occur in late winter or earliest spring, a decision that reflects a precise understanding of the relationship between maternal nutritional condition and offspring survival. If lambs are born too early, into the deepest cold, mortality rates climb steeply. If born too late, they miss the first flush of spring grass that the mothers need to produce adequate milk. The timing of breeding in autumn is therefore calculated backward from the desired birth window, accounting for gestation length and the likely date of snowmelt at each elevation. The herders are running a calendar inside a calendar. When a birth happens in winter, and some always do, slightly off schedule, the response is immediate and practiced. The newborn is brought inside the main living space, close to the fire, until it is dry and its core temperature is stable. The mother is brought as close as the household structure allows, because separation at birth disrupts the bonding process that determines whether the mother will accept the lamb going forward. A rejected lamb in winter is nearly impossible to hand-raise successfully, given the demands already on the household. The management of birth bonding in cold conditions is one of the most quietly skilled things these families do, and it happens in the middle of the night, in the dark, in temperatures that would send most people back to bed without hesitation. The fire at the end of the day is not decorative. It is the hub of a system. The central hearth in an Afghan highland home in winter serves multiple simultaneous functions that a modern heating engineer would struggle to consolidate into a single device. It heats the room. It dries wet clothing and saddlebags and rope. It cooks the food that will give the family the caloric density they need for another day of physical labor in cold air. It heats the water that will be carried to the animals in the morning. It provides the light by which women card wool, repair equipment, and do the indoor work that winter concentrates into the household. And it serves as the gathering point where the knowledge of the day is exchanged, where the condition of a specific animal is discussed, where tomorrow's weather is evaluated based on what the wind did at sunset, where the state of the hay reserve is mentally recalculated against the likely remaining weeks of snowpack. The fuel for that fire is its own management challenge. In the tree-line zones, wood is available but carefully rationed, because every tree removed from a slope is a tree that no longer holds soil against spring runoff. Communities that have managed these landscapes for generations understand this trade-off and regulate cutting accordingly. Above the tree line, dried animal dung becomes the primary fuel, collected throughout summer and autumn and stored in large quantities. This is not an inferior fuel source. When properly dried and stored, dung cakes burn with a slow, steady, manageable heat that is in some ways better suited to a small enclosed space than the intense, fast-burning heat of wood. The dung also produces less dangerous concentrated smoke than green or partially wet wood, which matters in rooms with limited ventilation and multiple people sleeping in close proximity. Ventilation itself is a problem that these highland homes solve in a way that demonstrates real environmental intelligence. The need to retain heat is in direct tension with the need to remove smoke, carbon dioxide, and the moisture exhaled by people and animals sharing enclosed space. Too closed, and the air becomes toxic. Too open, and the heat bleeds out. Traditional highland construction addresses this through a ceiling aperture, sometimes adjustable, sometimes fixed, positioned above the fire to allow rising smoke to exit, while the heavier, warmer air at breathing height stays trapped in the lower portion of the room. The fire draft creates a convective loop that pulls fresh air in at floor level, circulates it upward through the heat of the fire, and exits the contaminated air from the top. It is a passive ventilation system that has been refined over centuries without a single fluid dynamics equation ever being written down. The social structure of winter herd life adds another layer to what is already a complex system. In many highland communities, winter is not managed by individual families in isolation. Cooperative arrangements, some formal and some informal, govern everything from shared access to water sources to the pooled labor that opens snowpaths after major storms. A single family cannot maintain an extensive network of paths, manage a barn emergency, and respond to a difficult birth simultaneously. The community is the redundancy system. When one household faces a crisis, an animal illness, a family member's injury, an unexpected collapse of a storage structure under snow load, the response is not bureaucratic. It is immediate and physical. Neighbors arrive, work happens. The crisis is absorbed into the collective capacity of the group, rather than destroying the individual household. This is why understanding winter herd life in Afghanistan purely through the lens of the individual family misses something fundamental. The unit of survival is not the household. It is the community organized around a shared landscape, a shared water source, and a shared understanding of the seasonal system. That community contains within it a distributed knowledge base. Different families holding different specializations, different elders holding the memory of extreme winters past, different young people absorbing the practices that will carry the system forward. The knowledge is not stored in any single mind. It lives in the relationships between people and their landscape. As the winter progresses into its hardest weeks, typically January and February in most of the highland zones, the calculus of survival sharpens. Hay reserves that seemed generous in November are now visibly diminishing. The herder is doing daily math, comparing what remains against what he estimates the winter still requires. If the snow came early and heavy, he may already be in a deficit position. Some families supplement their stored hay with brush and shrubs, the dried stems of plants that most people would overlook, which are browsed by goats especially, providing a marginal but meaningful caloric supplement. Others negotiate to purchase hay from families with surplus, a transaction that happens in these communities and has always happened, representing a form of social insurance against the inherent variability of the season. The animals themselves are not passive recipients of this management. Over generations of living in these high-altitude environments, the local breed of fat-tailed sheep, the dominant breed across much of highland Afghanistan, has developed physiological characteristics that make it significantly better adapted to extreme cold and variable feed availability than exotic commercial breeds. The fat tail is not cosmetic. It is a lipid storage organ, directly analogous in function to the hump of a camel. During periods of feed restriction, the body mobilizes fat from the tail to meet its energy needs, allowing the animal to maintain core functions and pregnancy at lower feed inputs than a breed without this reserve. The herder who understands this, and every experienced herder does, knows that a sheep with a well-developed fat tail at the start of winter has a meaningful biological buffer against the hardest weeks. The selection of breeding animals across generations has quietly optimized for this trait without any formal breeding program ever existing. There is something that happens in the evening, after the animals are settled, and the fire has caught properly, and the family is gathered around it, that captures the full weight of what winter herd life actually is. The children are there. The smallest ones are already close to sleep, warmed by the fire and by the bodies around them. The older ones are watching how a piece of harness is repaired, how wool is pulled and twisted into thread, how an adult speaks about the weather tomorrow and what it means for the path to the water source. They are not being formally taught, but they are learning, with the completeness that only comes from being inside a living practice rather than being told about it from the outside. This is how the knowledge moves, not through books or schools or workshops, but through the accumulated hours of shared winter, the daily decisions made in plain sight of people who will one day make those same decisions themselves. A child who has spent 10 or 15 winters watching a father or grandfather manage hay reserves, read animal condition, maintain snow paths, and respond to emergencies carries a cognitive model of that system that no amount of outside training could replicate. The knowledge is not abstract. It is spatial, sensory, relational. It lives in the body as much as in the mind. And this is perhaps the most overlooked truth about winter herd life in these Afghan highlands. What the outside world sees, when it sees anything at all, is a landscape of scarcity, cold, and apparent simplicity. What is actually operating is a multi-layered adaptive system that integrates animal biology, landscape reading, architectural design, social cooperation, seasonal resource management, and intergenerational knowledge transfer into a unified practice that has sustained human and animal life in one of the most demanding environments on Earth for longer than most modern agricultural systems have existed. The people running this system are not waiting for development. They are not in need of being told how to manage their animals or their winter. They built the solution to a problem most modern people have never had to solve. And they have been running it successfully, generation after generation, in snow and darkness and fire and silence, without any of us ever really noticing. If this changed how you see these communities, if you are walking away from this video with a different sense of what intelligence looks like when it is adapted to the land and the cold and the animals and the season, then leave a comment below. Tell us what you want to see next. There are shepherdesses managing winter flocks alone in the high passes of Bamyan. There are families whose architecture has not changed in 300 years and whose walls are warmer than most modern insulation. There are food systems built entirely around the logic of altitude and cold that would astonish any nutritionist. There is so much more here. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it. The evening fire burns down. The animals breathe in the dark of the barn, warm from each other, from the deep litter beneath them, from the walls their owners built to hold the cold outside. Tomorrow the paths will need to be broken open again. The water will need to be carried. The hay will need to be counted. And a man who was already awake before the sun considered rising will be moving through the dark toward his animals, because the system demands it, because the animals require it, and because somewhere in that demanding, unglamorous daily precision, something remarkable is being kept alive.